Thank you very much, and I want to also express my gratitude to the several institutional and personal hosts that have made this day's deliberations possible. In the 14th Federalist paper, which appeared on November 30th, 1787, James Madison, writing as Publius, offered a comment that supplies a useful starting point for my remarks this afternoon. Why, Madison challenged, is the experiment of an extended republic to be rejected merely because it may comprise what is new? Is not the glory of the people of America that whilst they have paid a decent regard to the opinions of former times and other nations, they have not suffered a blind veneration for antiquity to overrule the suggestions of their own good sense, the knowledge of their own situation, and the lessons of their own experience? Madison's words invite a localized reading of the passage. If the proposed constitution for a new federal union of 13 separate states occupying an extensive territory across the eastern seaboard of North America violated an established orthodoxy that republican government could succeed only in a state of limited extent, this matter would be settled according to an explicitly American wisdom. But inevitably, Madison's confidence also drew on a larger fund of experience and argument. What concerns me most is Madison's general posture, his embrace of novelty and innovation. Why should an experiment be rejected just because it's experimental? My aim in what I present in the following remarks is to suggest some of the larger intellectual world of 18th century legal thought which facilitated this kind of confidence in novelty and experiment. And I shall include in this the 18th century pursuit of a new science of a legislator. The idea of a legislative science has long since lost its grip on the legal and political imagination of today. But in the 18th century, it occupied an important space in the landscape of the moral sciences, that is, in the forms of knowledge relevant to the study of human nature and human society. The great literary monument of Enlightenment learning, the French Encyclopedia of Diderot and d'Alembert, contained a lengthy article on the topic Legislature. And the imitative English language version, the Encyclopedia Britannica, likewise contained an article on legislation that ran to over 40 pages. In 1795, about 7 years after the publication of the original installments of the Federalist Papers, Dugald Stewart, then the professor of moral philosophy at Edinburgh University, instructed that the most celebrated works produced in Europe during the last 30 years had aimed at the improvement of society by enlightening the policy of actual legislators. Among such celebrated productions, Stewart cited the works of the French economists Quesnay and Turgot, the works of the Spanish statesman Campomanes, and the Milanese jurist Cesare Beccaria. But pride of place belonged to Stewart's Scottish countryman, Adam Smith, whose 1976 Wealth of Nations unquestionably, as he put it, comprised the most comprehensive and perfect work that has yet appeared on the general principles of any branch of legislation. These comments figured in a brief biographical sketch of Smith, who had died 5 years earlier. And Stewart, as we now say, had an agenda, which was to rescue Smith and his fellow generation of Scottish reforming moralists from any taint of French revolutionary extremism and zealotry. The biography appeared in the same era as the French Revolutionary Terror. The Wealth of Nations, after all, had developed a sweeping indictment of the legal structure of economic protections which shaped Britain's imperial ambitions, and advanced an alternative program of free trade and commercial empire that Smith himself identified as a utopia. Stewart, however, emphasized the practical orientation of Smith's economic inquiry, Whatever its methodological novelty and provocative findings, Smith's instruction was wisely aimed not at reckless revolutionaries, but actual legislators. The Wealth of Nations is frequently celebrated as the first major contribution to modern economics, as a groundbreaking exercise in modern social science. But Smith himself, like Stuart, identified his political economy as a branch of the science of a legislator. The work was replete with the categories of 18th century jurisprudence: rights and justice, property and title, exchange and obligation. As a professor at Glasgow University, Smith regularly offered an esteemed course of lectures on jurisprudence, where he first explored the topics examined in his Economics, and placed this teaching within a great flowering of legal speculation he recognized as a leading instance of conceptual innovation. Jurisprudence, he explained in his 1759 Treatise on the Moral Sentiments, formed part of a general system of morality and ethics. It aimed at a systematic treatment of those general rules which governed the practices associated with the virtue of justice. In its traditional manifestations, jurisprudence examined the rules that operated in particular local and national settings. But since the 17th century, jurisprudence had been transformed by the philosophical project to construct what Smith referred to as a system of natural jurisprudence, a theory of the general principles which ought to run through and be the foundation of the laws of all nations. Although numerous theorists had contributed to this pride of place, the most important figure was the celebrated Dutch jurist Hugo Grotius, whose 1625 treatise on the laws of war and peace, Smith reported, represented still the most complete work that had yet been given up on the subject of natural law. Smith was very conventional in singling out Grotius and his theory of natural right or natural law as the transformative development in the history of modern law. According to the inflated praise of the enthusiasts, Grotius had rescued moral and legal theory by shattering the mistaken reasoning and false premises of medieval scholasticism and the classical authors upon which it drew. His weighty Latin tome on the rights of war and peace enjoyed extensive currency through the 18th century. In that century alone, there were 20 Latin editions, 6 French editions, 5 German editions, 2 Dutch editions, 2 English editions, 1 Italian edition, and a manuscript version in Russian translation. And the best of all these were based on the elaborately edited version of 1720 produced by the French jurist Jean Barbeyrac, which became and remains still authoritative. It was the English translation of Barbeyrac's edition of Grotius that found its way into countless gentlemen's collections in the English-speaking world, such as the copy which was owned by General George Washington and now resides in Harvard's library. This remarkable record of translations and reprintings reflects the extent to which Grotian natural jurisprudence had become the common currency of shared learning for the most ambitious efforts to think systematically and generally about the nature of the law and its moral and social purposes. When, for example, in 1790, the Scottish-trained jurist, Pennsylvania politician, member of the Constitutional Convention, Federalist advocate, and future Supreme Court Justice James Wilson offered a learned course of lectures at the Restored College of Pennsylvania, and the lectures were so learned it took Wilson 3 years to actually present them. His special aim was to explain and vindicate the emerging legal and political order of the newly independent United States and to repudiate the false legal learning of his great adversary in England, William Blackstone. But Wilson began his course of lectures, as was then absolutely typical, by first considering the general moral foundations of law, which immediately and expressly brought him to questions of natural right and natural law and the organizing structure of Grotius's natural jurisprudence. Half a century earlier, when Wilson's great target, Sir William Blackstone, offered at Oxford University an even more noteworthy course of lectures on the laws of England, which formed the basis of the most influential law book ever published in the English language, Blackstone's 4-volume Commentaries on the Laws of England, he acknowledged a similar challenge. In introducing, for example, a volume-length survey of England's immensely arcane rules governing property and its transfer, he noted that when law was considered solely as a matter of practice, general foundational questions could easily be avoided. But when law was to be treated as a rational science, it required an investigation of how legal rules had their foundation in nature and in the law of nature. For later jurists, Grotius' importance concerns matters of method as well as substance. He began his legal theory with a purposefully spare set of claims concerning human nature and the purposes of human society. Prior to the establishment of organized political communities, let's call this a state of nature, individuals enjoyed a basic equality, such that no individual exercised a permanent natural authority to command others. Each person pursued his or her own self-preservation with the moral capacity to acquire the material goods needed for such self-preservation, including the power to defend oneself from the attacks of others. Call these capacities natural rights. From these premises, it was possible to identify the most fundamental features of schemes of collective cooperation, structures of public authority, the rules of positive law, by simply asking the question, what benefits would lead individuals to forsake natural freedom and equality for the advantages of organized community, as well as the kinds of exchanges of natural freedom that would be required for the realization of these benefits. Call such transfers of natural rights a social contract. The premises of the theory concerning mankind's natural moral state were thought impossible to deny. Who could question a natural right to preserve oneself under circumstances that cause no harm to other people? And this was designed to overcome the most corrosive forms of moral skepticism and to hold even in the face of the kind of implacable religious violence that in Grotius's lifetime plunged Europe into decades of destructive sectarian war. As Grotius himself put the claim in a singularly notorious passage in the natural law literature, his account of the human moral condition would survive, quote, even if we were to suppose what we cannot suppose without the greatest wickedness, that there is no God, or that human affairs are of no concern to him, close quote. Significantly for the purposes of today's discussions and for the purposes of the Franklin Project more generally, Grotius's treatment of law and rights was thought to instantiate much the same kind of intellectual impulse that we now associate with the contemporaneous scientific revolution, the world, for example, of Descartes and Bacon that these morning's lectures recaptured for us so eloquently. For 18th century readers, the link was made through the routinely repeated claim that Grotius composed his jurisprudence under the direct encouragement of Francis Bacon. The argument was in fact spurious, but the putative personal connection of the two, such towering representatives of the Enlightenment, boasted a certain plausibility. Bacon had devoted a large section to the advancement of learning to the discussion of law, where he distinguished carefully those general principles of justice from the implementation of these principles in particular states according to local circumstances and environments. Natural jurisprudence, the Grotian Project, provided a particular technique for the systematic delineation of these general principles. Even more, Bacon and Grotius, modern natural philosophy and modern natural law shared a common enemy in the long dominant Aristotelianism of the medieval universities and its educational curricula. Whereas Aristotelian ethics presumed natural inequality and political community as the prerequisites for the practice of virtue, the idea of a pre-political state of nature of having moral character was simply implausible, incoherent, mistake of categories. Natural rights theory began with pre-political moral equality and moral freedom, understood justice in terms of the maintenance of basic rights, and relegated the rest of the canon of the Aristotelian virtues to the practice of what Grotius termed imperfect right. It was this repudiation of centuries of stifling orthodoxy that enabled Grotius, as Bergerac, his editor, immodestly put it, to raise the science of morality from the dead. The exaggeration is no doubt as revealing as its several inaccuracies. The expressed aspiration to treat law as a rational science figured so frequently in 18th century legal letters that it's tempting to press further on the linkages between natural science and the study of law. Jurists who disparaged the disorderly heterogeneity of Europe's legal inheritance, in which national law jumbled together fragments of legal custom, Roman and canon law materials, and episodic royal legislation, invoked science in their quest for a form of law that would exhibit systematic order and harmonious parts. Likewise, reason became a favored rallying cry to decry the techniques of rote learning and memorization that masqueraded as education in so many tiers of professional legal training. But I think in general caution is needed here. The invocation of rational science in these legal settings captured a range of disparate and even antithetic positions and methods rather than any tidy consensus concerning what it meant to be scientific in the case of law. Often the usage denoted the traditional earlier notion of science as organized knowledge, as opposed to any specific sense of method regarding proof and demonstration. Where the intellectual transformation attributed to Grotius' Bacon-like achievement was most readily evidenced was in the several important and distinct genres of inquiry which 18th century jurists believed to have emerged from the project of renewal they delighted to find in the literature of natural law and natural right. The perceived impact ramified through a distinguished range of new moral literatures. One of these strands remains a standard component of the modern academy. The genre of social contract theory associated with Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau still continues to be a familiar canon in the teaching and study of political theory. Hobbes and Locke were recognizably the heirs of Grotius. The case of Rousseau is predictably more complex. And the famous differences among these theorists concerning the conditions of the state of nature, the capacity of human reason, the limits of legitimate political authority, and so on, provide us with a helpful indication of the manner in which natural jurisprudence provided an organizing framework for treating questions concerning the morality and legitimacy of political life, rather than providing unifying answers to these questions. Another line of development was found in the weighty volumes of legal writing on the law of nature and nations that addressed the relationships amongst independent states and independent sovereigns, who for this purpose operated in a kind of state of nature with regard to each other. In the standard modern disciplinary histories of international law, Grotius' Rights of War and Peace still functions as the foundational modern discussion. Indeed, our own term international law was an invention of the 18th century, coined by the reforming English jurist Jeremy Bentham in the 1780s, who sought a clearer nomenclature to denote a legal field dominated for Bentham by the more ambiguous term, the law of nations, favored by the natural lawyers. Perhaps the most extensive form of influence exercised by natural jurisprudence was the brand of right-based ethics that came to be institutionalized in the academies of Protestant Europe and British North America via a new literature of moral pedagogy that was developed from the late 17th century onwards. Key here was the work of Grotius's most famous successor, Samuel van Pufendorf, who recast Grotian natural rights theory in his massive 1672 treatise on the law of nature and nations. Given the forbidding scale of that work, Pufendorf had the good sense to publishing a compact didactic summary of his rights theory, published as The Duties of Man and Citizen. His title, De Officiis, shrewdly mimicked the title of Cicero's prestigious ethical manual, De Officiis, which had dominated moral education for literally centuries. Pufendorf's version was soon adopted as the teaching text in the German and Swedish universities where he himself was based. The process of adoption continued, and the law of nature became a staple vehicle for instructing the future leaders of the society on the responsibilities of private ethics and the duties of public life. The 18th century additions to this literature of ethical pedagogy, the text produced by Francis Hutchinson at the University of Glasgow, Thomas Rutherford at the University of Cambridge, Jean Barlamaki in Geneva, spread widely throughout British North America, where it likewise became entrenched for the basic training of a rising generation of political elites. It formed a part of the curriculum which was readily adopted in places like the University of Virginia, Jefferson and Madison's educational experiment, which Professor Lerner spoke about this morning. Let me turn finally to one of the 18th century legacies of this sweeping reorientation in legal theory, the project to construct a theory of the science of legislation. I began with the example of Adam Smith and Smithian political economy because it reveals so clearly the path of intellectual lineage from Grotius' natural jurisprudence, as invoked by Smith in the theory of the moral sentiments, through the discussion of rights and property in Smith's lectures on jurisprudence, to the account of wealth, commerce, and justice in The Wealth of Nations, which made the science of wealth for Smith such a fitting branch of the science of a legislator. As with natural jurisprudence, the jurists of legislation strove to make plain the novelty and the modernity of their intellectual labors. Montesquieu's Spirit of the Laws, a work to which I shall return in a moment, came adorned with a Latin tag out of Ovid declaring, in translation, "I take no model in composing this." Cesare Beccaria, an exemplar of Dougal Stewart's canon of the most celebrated writers of the last 30 years, began his reforming study of the aims and technology of criminal punishment by contrasting his rigorous analysis and enlightened approach with the unprincipled opportunism and ad hoc spasms of public power that hitherto guided the exercise of punishment. For the first time, he claimed, he furnished the lawmaker with the resources to survey the entire field of social life and law and to advance through punishment the unifying goal of the greatest happiness of an entire community. Jeremy Bentham, who is to devote some 60 years to the effort to construct a comprehensive system of legislative codification complete, as he put it, in all its branches, and displaying the dictates of utility in every line, announced in his first major publication of 1776, "The age we live in is a busy age, in which knowledge is rapidly advancing towards perfection." Under the direction of this self-described Newton of the legislative sciences, law would ascend to its proper place in the march of discovery and reform. The science of the legislator rarely acquired, and in this way it contrasts with natural law theory, the kind of institutional support afforded by structures of university curricula or tiers of royal government. But at mid-century, it acquired a kind of monumental statement that could serve as a kind of Baconian reference point for natural of the kind that existed in the case of natural jurisprudence and Grotius's Rights of War and Peace. This was the unwieldy compendium of classical learning and comparative political analysis, jurisprudence and legal history, natural science and exotic ethnography, presented by Montesquieu in his celebrated 1748 three-volume work on the spirit of the laws. In a work that frustrated any easy summary or tidy conclusions, Montesquieu declared that his unifying goal was to teach the legislator the spirit of modern moderation. I'm now taking my life in my own hands by talking about Montesquieu in the presence of Stuart Warner, but it's only about 2 paragraphs, so I'll see if I get away with it. Because so much of the programmatic orientation of Montesquieu's jurisprudence was directed at the contemporary condition of French monarchy and the case for preserving the authority and privileges of his own rank of hereditary nobility, it is often difficult for us moderns to recognize the selective and modernizing logic so often advanced in the spirit of the laws. In part, once again, in the case of jurisprudence, there was a novelty of method. Montesquieu quickly dispatched the discussion of laws of nature and rights and states of nature in a tightly compressed initial chapter in the massive tome. Instead, he focused attention on other jurisprudential puzzles, the manner in which the combinations of social, political, and natural forces shaped how abstract principles of justice came to be applied and to be abused in the concrete experience of human law. In part, novelty and modernization concerned the protracted analysis of the relationship between political systems on the one hand and human laws on the other, which comprised one of Montesquieu's leading themes. Here he developed an innovative typology of political forms that served to disclose and highlight the powerful contrast between the political experience of the long-revered models of ancient Greece and Rome and the post-classical experience of modern Europe. The contrast operated on several complex dimensions, which spanned matters of political psychology, classical republican virtue versus modern monarchic honor, to that of institutional design, the classical mixed constitution versus the modern distribution of legislative, executive, and judicial political functions. Let me spend a concluding moment on one such revealed institutional contrast, the difference for Montesquieu between ancient popular assemblies, bodies composed entirely of relevant qualified citizens who are members of the assembly simply as a function of their citizen status, and the representative councils of the feudal system, which was composed of persons selected to represent in the structures of central government some larger locality or social rank. This point that a modern representative body was different from a classical popular assembly was not new with Montesquieu. But his placement of the point within a large comparative frame and a celebrated treatment of the logic of constitutional liberty served to support a rich vein of constitutional and legal discussions in the 18th century concerning the capacity of representative institutions to withstand the corrupting dynamics of political life and the vices associated with popular self-rule. Was, as Richard Price, for example, insisted, an elected representative like a delegate or an agent charged to execute the will of his local electors? Or was he, as Edmund Burke countered, charged to pursue national responsibilities and collective interests, notwithstanding the locality who had elected him? Did a representative assembly simply embody the political will of the electorate? Or were the political representatives chosen precisely because they enjoyed the talent and the experience to govern better and differently than the people themselves? Such questions were pressing and novel precisely because of the modernity and growing power of the political form to which they were addressed. Given all this discussion, it is perhaps not surprising that Madison's candid defense of American federal constitutional experimentation, with which I began these remarks, appeared specifically in the context of a discussion concerning the nature of self-government through elected representatives, and the ability of a representative version of self-government to overcome the traditional challenge of geographic scale. In the more famous 10th Federalist paper, Madison explored the capacity of an extended representative republic to withstand the traditional challenge of factions and sectional interest. Among the several novelties of the proposed federal union, its supporters explained, was the manner in which it mixed different networks of political representation while extending the logic of representation through all the principal institutions of government: a national representation in the case of the House of Representatives, a state representation in the case of the Senate, a hybrid representation in the case of the Presidential Electoral College. Behind this novel scheme for law and political authority, I've tried to suggest here, lay well-rehearsed understandings of rupture and innovation in the prestigious jurisprudence of the era, a jurisprudence that had extended and saturated popular education of the elite, as well as more learned legal speculation. Madison's audience, we can presume, came well prepared for his blunt and telling question. Why is the experiment of an extended republic to be rejected merely because it may comprise what is new? Thank you.
Thank you, David. And we've looked at the Grotius and Bentham and the study of legal science. In our final talk this afternoon, we'll instead look at Joseph Priestley, the scientific knowledge and the public enlightenment. We welcome Jan Golinski of the University of New Hampshire, who is in the History Department of Humanities program. He has a BA and MA degrees in natural science from Christ's College, Cambridge University, so they're colleagues there as well. He has a PhD in history and philosophy of science from the University of Leeds, and he has taught at the University of Lancaster, at Churchill College in Cambridge, and at Princeton University. He has held fellowships at the University of Wisconsin, at the William Andrews Clark Library, UCLA, at the Huntington Library, and at the Dibner Institute for History of Science and Technology at MIT. He's been on the faculty of the University of New Hampshire since 1990 as a recipient of the University of New Hampshire's Outstanding Faculty Award. Dr. Golinski teaches general education courses in the history of science from the ancient world to the 20th century, including courses on the history of European science since the Renaissance. He offers graduate courses in early modern science, the Enlightenment, European intellectual history, and historiography. Professor Golinski's books include Science as Public Culture, Chemistry and Enlightenment in Britain, Making Natural Knowledge, Constructivism and the History of Science, and the edited volume on Sciences in Enlightened Europe, and most recently, British Weather and the Climate of Enlightenment. Professor Galinsky.
Thank you very much. Well, let me add my thanks to the organizers and sponsors of this wonderful event today. Thank you for including me on the program. So I'm going to slightly shift emphasis. I'm going to talk a little bit more about practice of science, though also about scientific ideas. I want to talk about what we can call the epistemic practices of science, the practices by which it makes knowledge. And I see these as very importantly reflecting values and as connected to political and social values. In the Enlightenment, how knowledge was made in the sciences, at least according to some people's way of thinking, showed how society should be organized politically. The Enlightenment scientific community seemed, at least to some observers, to embody such ideals as egalitarianism, openness, and democratic participation, which could with profit be applied more generally in society. Now, the person I'm going to take to exemplify this connection is Joseph Priestley, who lived from 1733 to 1804. Priestley's life began in Yorkshire, and it ended in central Pennsylvania. It connected the Enlightenment in England with the early national era in the United States, where he spent his last 10 years. Priestley was a Unitarian minister, and hence a dissenter from the Church of England. He was a chemist and experimental philosopher, as he described himself. And he was the discoverer of what he called dephlogisticated air, which we call oxygen, and of several other gases also. He was a radically innovative thinker on theological and political questions. He was driven out of England because of his sympathies for the French Revolution. In terms of these epistemic values, I see Priestley as representing a radical version of what we can call public empiricism. He cultivated and defended the value of widespread public participation in the creation of scientific knowledge. In doing this, he drew upon a tradition going back to the late 17th century, rooted in the philosophy of John Locke, in the writings of Robert Boyle, and in the activities of the early Royal Society of London. The epistemic values of public empiricism were widely adopted during the decades of the Enlightenment in Britain and elsewhere. But by energetically re-articulating these ideas and uncompromisingly insisting on them in an era of revolutionary change, Priestley gave them a specifically radical inflection. As a result, he found himself pilloried in print and in the speeches of British politicians, and driven from his home in Birmingham by a reactionary mob. In his final years, he invested his hopes for social and political reform in the United States, with its Republican Constitution and its Bill of Rights upheld by its third president, Thomas Jefferson. So, in tracing the roots of this idea of public empiricism, one obvious source we can go back to is the philosophy of John Locke, the primary philosopher of empiricism. Locke insisted that all human knowledge derives from the senses or from the mind reflecting on sensations. And this philosophical position carries with it a certain sort of egalitarianism. Since none of us is born with innate knowledge of any kind, we are all, in that sense, born equal. Empiricism places a considerable burden on education, in which Locke took a great interest, as the key to developing human potential. And it recognizes the great diversity in knowledge and ideas that individuals may acquire in the course of their upbringing. Hence, empiricism tends to encourage toleration of diverse opinions, for example, regarding religion. Those who are brought up in different circumstances can be expected to have developed different religious ideas, and this suggests that they should not be penalized for holding them. Perhaps the only universal foundation for religious belief is to be found in our common experience of the natural world, which Locke thought should lead us to revere its creator and designer. Locke himself was always careful to acknowledge the authority of the Christian revelation, which along with nature provided the foundations of religious belief. Priestley would later say the same thing. But Locke's ideas were taken up and expanded upon without this proviso by deist writers who wanted a purely naturalistic religion without any taint of specific Christian doctrine. But if Locke was the philosopher of empiricism, the members of the early Royal Society had in fact already begun to put it into practice. Locke had been associated since the 1650s with Robert Boyle and the other individuals who founded the Royal Society in London in 1660, and Locke remained a fellow of the Society until the end of his life. Boyle and his colleagues had devised practices that institutionalized empiricism as the path to knowledge. Much of what they did was guided by the works of the man they looked up to as the founder of the arts, Francis Bacon. They took a series of measures that can be seen as correctives to what Bacon had called the four idols. We didn't hear this morning from Ralph in his lecture, but this is one of the central, one of the most striking images in Bacon's philosophy is the idea of the four idols, the obstacles that stand in the way of the advancement of human learning. And in many respects, one can see what the Royal Society did as attempts to circumvent these four idols. Thus, Boyle and the other fellows of the Royal Society insisted that written or oral communications should be composed only of factual information, stripped as far as possible of theoretical interpretation. This was to overcome Bacon's idols of the theatre, the seductions of theoretical systems that purported to explain everything while presenting only a narrow selection of facts. The Royal Society championed the use of instruments, optical, mathematical, and experimental, to overcome what Bacon had called the idols of the tribe, the inherent limits of the senses that restricted the capabilities of all human beings. The Royal Society developed collective witnessing, gathering groups of fellows at meetings to watch an experiment or view a specimen. By arriving at agreement about what was seen collectively, they intended to overcome what Bacon had called the idols of the cave, the prejudices and predispositions that individuals acquire from their upbringing. And finally, the Royal Society practiced a style of written communication that allowed for virtual witnessing by those who could not be present to bear witness directly. An amply descriptive but unornamented style of writing was favoured as a response to what Bacon had called the idols of the marketplace, the ambiguities and inaccuracies of human language. Now, as has been argued very forcefully by Stephen Shapin and Simon Schaffer, these practices in the Royal Society inevitably fell short of what they were intended to achieve. Boyle's style of writing concealed some features of his experiments. In the case of the air pump, for example, the role of the servants who were actually doing the work on the experiment. Boyle didn't mention them, even while he verbosely described other circumstances. And of course, theoretical interpretation could not be entirely excluded from these descriptions. As Thomas Hobbes vehemently complained, Boyle's narratives embedded within them his theory that air pressure was the key to what was going on in the experiments with the air pump. Furthermore, as Hobbes also noted, the value of collective witnessing was diminished by the fact that the Royal Society meetings were actually not open to anyone who wanted to go. Hobbes himself had been blackballed by the other fellows when he tried to join the Society. The empiricist practices of the Society were in fact largely drawn from the behavioral repertoire of a relatively exclusive social stratum. Genteel status at a minimum was required, and women were entirely excluded. Reported facts were underwritten by the convention that a gentleman's word should be accepted by another gentleman. For a fellow of the Royal Society to doubt what another fellow testified would be a serious breach of social decorum. On this basis, the circulation of what later came to be called gentlemanly facts was securely established. Now, it is indeed true that they were initially institutionalized at first in these small and relatively restricted social circumstances, but nonetheless, these epistemic practices spread rapidly with the creation of the Enlightenment public sphere. In clubs and societies, in commercial gathering places such as coffeehouses and libraries, and in the media of printed books and periodicals, the conventions for communicating scientific information were widely adopted in the 18th century. Collective witnessing of experiments was a feature of the philosophical societies that were established in imitation of the Royal Society in many locations, first in such major centres as Oxford, Dublin, and Edinburgh, and later in more provincial locations like Bath, Derby, and Spalding in Lincolnshire. The Lunar Society of Birmingham, with which Priestley became involved on moving to that city in 1780, was one of the most famous of these self-organizing scientific societies. They were joined by hundreds of other groups: conversation societies, literary societies, student clubs, subscription libraries, and local improvement societies, which flourished throughout the British Isles and beyond. And their activities were complemented by those of public lecturers, often itinerants, who brought experimental demonstrations to audiences which included women and children, wherever they could raise a subscription. In the first decade of the 18th century, mathematics and natural philosophy were already being taught by these entrepreneurial private lecturers in London coffeehouses. By the 1740s, Benjamin Martin had pioneered the life of the scientific lecturer on the road, taking his experimental show to towns and cities in the Midlands and the north of England. In the 1760s, there were dozens of men following this lifestyle, and their number had swollen to hundreds by the end of the century. By that stage, collective witnessing of scientific phenomena had become a truly public activity. And America also had its conversation clubs, its itinerant lecturers, and eventually learned societies, although these developments were slightly more delayed than in England, reflecting the greater geographical dispersal of the population and the slower growth of cities and commerce. In 1727, Benjamin Franklin and his friends formed the Junto in Philadelphia, which was a group devoted to discussion of science and other areas of learning. In the same year, 1727, Isaac Greenwood, a Harvard professor, gave the first of his courses of scientific lectures to a public audience in Boston. Natural history societies, medical societies, improvement societies, and library clubs subsequently grew up in the major urban centers, though many at first proved short-lived. In the early 1750s, Ebenezer Kinnersley established himself as the most successful public scientific lecturer of the colonial period. Kinnersley toured with apparatus to demonstrate Franklin's discoveries concerning electricity. He visited Annapolis, Williamsburg, Charlestown, Boston, Newport, New York, and St. John's on the island of Antigua before returning to Philadelphia to teach at the college there. American efforts to create a formal scientific society reached fruition with the establishment by Franklin and others of the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia in 1743. Although it subsequently lapsed for a couple of decades, the American Philosophical Society was reconstituted on a permanent basis in 1767. Now, a good example of the kind of institutions in which public empiricism flourished in England was the Coffeehouse Philosophical Society, which met in London in the 1780s. The members included some who were professionally involved in the sciences, such as physicians and instrument makers, and others whose interest was by way of a gentlemanly avocation. The prevailing ethos was a free-flowing, genteel conversation. The society had rules stipulating that discussions should be open to all who were present, that the chairmanship should rotate among the members, and that no one should stand to greet latecomers. These rules seem to have been aimed at cultivating an atmosphere of egalitarianism among those who attended. Discussion was expected to cover natural philosophy, i.e. the physical sciences, in general, and not to descend into specialist jargon or mathematical demonstrations. Topics were nominated by the senior member present and were usually of broad scientific significance. So, for example, they talked about the nature of electricity or light, or the relations between heat and matter, or what caused changes in the weather. The aim was that the subject should touch upon the interests of all members so that all could participate in discussing it. The physicians in the society were put on warning not to indulge in professional shop talk. And on one occasion, a member was denied permission to read a paper on astronomy because it was thought likely to be too mathematical for everyone else to follow. Mathematical demonstrations, it seems, were appropriate for a school, but not for polite discussion in the public sphere, where it was important to show respect for the independence of each individual's judgment. Now, Priestley was an honorary member of the Coffeehouse Philosophical Society, though he was living in Birmingham by the time it was formed and rarely attended its meetings. But Priestley's epistemic values were close to those of this metropolitan society, as he had already shown in his scientific writings from the 1760s on. When he first began to take an interest in the sciences, Priestley had been associated with a group who were experimenting on electricity in London. His friendship with Franklin, who was a member of this group, dates from that time. These so-called electricians overlapped with another circle, the more politically oriented Club of Honest Whigs, in which Franklin was also involved, with the prominent dissenter Richard Price. Priestley moved easily between scientific and political associations, understanding the value of such contexts for support and communication. As he took on the role of a scientific writer and researcher, he sought to widen the circles with which he communicated, to enlarge the population of those who were enrolled in witnessing and, where possible, replicating experiments. In his books on the chemistry of gases, which he started to produce in the early 1770s, Priestley used a narrative style reminiscent of Boyle's. He insisted that he was narrating the history of his experiments, including failures and dead ends. He said that he never knew in advance what was going to happen and was often surprised by the outcome. He encouraged readers to perform the procedures themselves, emphasizing that he possessed no specialized or expensive instruments, but had mostly managed with household objects from the laundry room and the kitchen. Economy and modesty were the keynotes of his self-presentation as an author. Economy was given as the reason for introducing the so-called nitrous air test, which was a chemical test of how breathable a gas was. And this had the advantage of doing away with the need to sacrifice mice in the experiments. Now, that was one obvious way to test how breathable the gas was. You put a mouse in there and you waited to see how long it survived. The nitrous air test made it unnecessary to catch and keep all of these mice that Priestley had previously been using. So economy was a key feature of the way he described his experiments, and modesty also was shown by his reluctance to indulge in speculative interpretations or even to give names to what he discovered. Only in the cases of phenomena that were manifestly new would Priestley overcome this reluctance to coin new terminology, and then only after consulting with colleagues. So it seems like the old Baconian idea of the idols of the marketplace, the traps and delusions of language, was something that Priestley had very much in mind. Now, Priestley himself rarely gave public lectures. In fact, he was afflicted with a speech impediment that gave him enough trouble in his job as a preacher, and he wasn't about to embark on large-scale public lectures. But he did cultivate close relationships with several lecturers who made his discoveries known through their performances in many parts of the British Isles. Adam Walker was one of these men, an itinerant lecturer in the north of England who adopted Priestley's discoveries into his repertoire in the early 1770s. Walker visited Priestley to learn his experimental techniques and apparently shared many of his mentor's values concerning the role of science in progressive enlightenment. Other lecturers soon picked up the torch, some of them personally connected with Priestley and others not. He welcomed all of their efforts as contributions to the diffusion of scientific knowledge, a process that he believed would inevitably bring with it the revelation of religious truth and political emancipation. Priestley had made these connections very clear in the preface to the first volume of his Observations and Experiments on Different Kinds of Air in 1772. Let me quote this passage. "The rapid process of knowledge, which like the progress of a wave of the sea or of light from the sun, extends itself not in this way or that way only, but in all directions, will, I doubt not, be the means under God of extirpating all error and prejudice, and of putting an end to all undue and usurped authority in the business of religion as well as of science, and all the efforts of the interested friends of corrupt establishments of all kinds will be ineffectual for their support in this enlightened age. And the English hierarchy, if there be anything unsound in its constitution, has equal reason to tremble even at an air pump or an electrical machine." Okay? So, for Priestley, enlightenment was understood quite literally as a process of illumination by the diffusion of knowledge. Public witnessing of scientific experiments with air pumps or electrical machines would lead inevitably to the defeat of ignorance and illegitimate authority. Widespread public involvement in the pursuit of science was the means by which truth would be disclosed, superstition banished, and tyranny overthrown. So Priestley was not saying simply that science should be popularized in a way that follows after the process of discovery. Rather, he was calling for the involvement of a large public in witnessing and replicating experiments as an essential feature of the dynamics of scientific knowledge if it were to play its true role in the providential progress of mankind. For this reason, free communication and discussion of scientific discoveries was seen by Priestley as more crucial than politeness or gentility. Priestley was in fact unabashed in assuming highly unpopular opinions, especially on theological and philosophical issues, and he was relentless in keeping up his side of an argument. He broke several friendships because of his unwillingness to relinquish his controversial positions, and he frustrated even those who remained his friends by refusing to keep quiet about what he believed. Priestley's reputation as an uncompromising controversialist exposed him to more severe criticism as political change took hold in the last decades of the 18th century. Priestley supported the rights of the American colonists in the 1770s. Later, he endorsed the aims of the French revolutionaries, which ended up attracting very serious opposition towards him. He was attacked by Edmund Burke and others in print and in Parliament. He was portrayed in scurrilous caricatures, along with other Whigs and reformers. And on the second anniversary of the fall of the Bastille in July 1791, his house and laboratory were burned by a violent crowd, given free rein by local aristocrats and magistrates. Not surprisingly, this confirmed Priestley's tendency to see political developments in apocalyptic terms. He had long sought to interpret contemporary events through the perspective of biblical prophecies. The age of revolutions reaffirmed his conviction that tyranny and corruption were about to be destroyed and a new era of millennial peace and prosperity ushered in. After taking refuge in the United States in the mid-1790s, he told President John Adams that the French Revolution was, quote, opening a new era in the world and presenting a near view of the millennium. Priestley's faith that Providence was continuing to work through historical events and that they were all tending to a millennial climax was coming by this stage to seem rather naive. Although he remained in America for the last decade of his life, it did not provide an entirely peaceful refuge for him. When he disembarked in Philadelphia in 1794, he immediately found himself the target of a ferocious pamphlet by William Cobbett, an English polemical writer who was then living in the United States and was allied with the Federalist Party. Cobbett charged Priestley with having encouraged revolution in Britain by advancing political demands under the guise of science and religion. Cobbett continued the onslaught for the next 5 years in his regular newsletter, Porcupine's Gazette, and succeeded in creating significant antagonism against Priestley among his neighbors when Priestley, settled in Northumberland, Pennsylvania. Things came to a head when letters written to Priestley from France by the English radical John Herford Stone were intercepted and published in London. Cobbett reprinted the letters in his Gazette in August 1798, claiming that they revealed Priestley as a dangerous agent of the French revolutionary regime who was loyal neither to Britain nor to the United States. Priestley defended himself, and Cobbett responded with another pamphlet attacking him, in which he called Priestley a liar, a hypocrite several times, and even a Jesuit, which was pretty hurtful for a Protestant dissenter. For a while, it seemed that Cobbett's attacks might succeed in getting President John Adams to expel Priestley from the country under the terms of the Alien and Sedition Acts, and his security was only guaranteed by Jefferson's election as president in 1800. At the same time as he was holding off these attacks on his political flank, Priestley was also keeping up a relentless, if sporadic, defense of his chemical theories. He had never accepted the French chemistry of Antoine Lavoisier and his allies. And his objections to the French chemistry revealed clearly some of his fundamental epistemic values. Priestley claimed that the French chemists' experiments were too elaborate and expensive, and therefore could not be widely replicated. Until they were made less elaborate and could be widely replicated, he insisted that his experimental results were more reliable. He also strenuously objected to the French chemists' invention of a new terminology for chemistry, the new nomenclature, in 1787, because that seemed to him an illegitimate appropriation of the language of science for a particular theory. Priestley likened these tactics to Robespierre's reign of terror, a rather tactless remark in view of the fact that Lavoisier himself had been guillotined by the revolutionary regime. Now, in upholding these values, Priestley recognized an ally in the man who saved him from a second exile, Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson was sympathetic to Priestley's Unitarian interpretation of Christian scriptures and doctrine, and he acknowledged his defense of liberty and the founding values of the Republic. In return, Priestley was respectful of Jefferson's role in drafting the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. He saw these documents as shields for the freedoms of speech and religion, which were essential to the establishment of truth, both religious and scientific. Shortly after Jefferson's election, Priestley wrote to pay tribute to him as a champion of liberty. And this is to quote Priestley again. The experience of more than 20 years leaves little room to doubt but that freedom is a state of things the most favorable to mutual candor, which is of great importance to domestic peace and good neighborhood, and to the cause of all truth, religious truth least of all accepted. When every question is thus left to free discussion, there cannot be a doubt but that truth will finally prevail and establish itself by its own evidence. And he must know little of mankind or of human nature who can imagine that truth of any kind will ultimately be unfavorable to general happiness. Now, in view of what he had actually experienced in the preceding 20 years, one might be tempted to say that Priestley was in denial here. His candor had not exactly been favorable to domestic peace and good neighborhood. On the contrary, his determination to speak his mind had roused at least some of his neighbors against him, violently in Birmingham and with more restrained hostility in Pennsylvania. Driven into exile once and threatened with it again, he could scarcely be said to have found free discussion conducive to his own happiness. Even those who remained his friends to the end recognized that he was blind to the way his blunt speaking irritated and offended people. He never seems to have grasped why he had the capacity to make enemies by speaking his mind. But to those who were more politically astute or politely mannered, this was not a mystery at all. And yet I don't think Priestley was, in fact, naive at this late stage of his life. And nor do I think he'd forgotten the troubles that had afflicted him. He was stubborn, for sure, and his determination to hold fast to his principles had perhaps inclined him to minimize the hostility he had aroused. But for him, the ideals he was articulating were of more than personal application. His individual experience was not the most important criterion for judging them. Rather, he was reasserting their universal validity, based on his most fundamental convictions. His insistence on the value of free discussion as the path to truth was founded on a belief in the human potential for salvation and the providential direction of history. Ultimately, given conditions of freedom, truth would prevail in religion and in science. Notwithstanding his personal travails and torments, Priestley's faith in this was unshaken to the end. Now, Priestley's example seems to me to raise a series of questions that we should consider as we grapple today with the question of the place of science in a free and democratic society. Do we still hold Priestley's conviction that free communication will lead to the revelation of truth? Is it possible to retain this view even without its foundation in a providential view of history and human nature? And if so, how far should freedom be taken in the making of scientific knowledge? Priestley seems to have seen no need for limits on public participation in witnessing and replicating phenomena. But should we really accord equal respect to every individual's judgment? Or do we have to recognize that some individuals are more qualified to judge than others? Are we going to weigh everyone's opinion equally on controversial scientific questions? Or do we need to preserve concentrations of expertise and resources that will be accorded privileged authority? What is the right balance between openness and restricted communication, between democratic participation and the recognition of expertise if we are to keep science advancing? These questions are still with us, and they're still pressing. In a sense, the issues are inherent in the program of public empiricism. That is to say, they are sure to emerge when scientific knowledge is made in a purportedly open and democratic society. For this reason, I think it's appropriate to pay some attention to the ideas of Joseph Priestley, one of the most uncompromising advocates of public empiricism in the era of the Enlightenment. Thank you.